You might have heard the name John Singer Sargent. He's pretty good at painting, so I've heard. His name's been going around so much lately because of the traveling exhibition fashioned by Sargent. I saw that exhibition in Boston this past fall, and it was really incredible. If you don't know the name, that's okay too. Sargent, I think, is this really beautiful gateway into 19th century art that's still fresh and feels fun and modern to look at. It's aged really well, unlike a lot of these old portraits that feel very out of touch. And a lot of people consider Sargent to be one of the best portrait painters of all time. I'm not so sure about that claim. I agree with the sentiment for sure, but if we look at the technical skill of other painters in the 19th century, there were hundreds and hundreds of other painters that were probably far more technical than Sargent was. But that's not what makes Sargent so great. What makes Sargent so great is his ruthless efficiency, this beautiful simplification in his technique. The way that he approached his drawings is very genius. That's what we want to learn from and study when we look at Sargent's works. So let's take that. I want to steal that essence. Let's make a drawing just like Sargent. But in order to do that, we're going to need to analyze some of his works first and understand how he makes the work that he does. One of the things that I see the most that I hate is people deifying the past. People looking at the past with a modern lens, or looking at the past and thinking, oh, these old masters, they were born with some level of virtuoso talent that can't be achieved. The only way I can learn to drawing is just keep hitting my head against the wall until I figure it out. But when you actually look and do the research, when you read the books that these guys wrote, you'll understand that it was just a rigorous academic training that allowed them to achieve this. It was just a system of education. And if we assume that people are just born with talent, this is where critical thinking goes to die. So how did Sargent learn how to paint? How can we recreate that technique? Sargent studied with a guy named Carolus Duran in the 1870s, and one look at Carolus' work and you'll understand entirely where Sargent comes from. He has the same bold brushstrokes, this thick paint, a nice attention to color, and an overall very direct approach. And by direct, I mean he just puts the right color, the right amount of paint in the right spot at the right time. He doesn't try to slowly build up layers and close in on it. It's that same level of confidence that Sargent goes on to accumulate and some say surpass Duran. But here's the thing, Duran didn't teach drawing. He was kind of a new age hippy-dippy teacher, and he didn't like to teach drawing, only his painting techniques. And if you know anything about French art in the 19th century, or just any academic art of any time, it's all about drawing. Painting is this upper level skill that stacks on top of the basis of drawing. So Sargent, at the same time that he studies with Duran, goes to the French Academy of Fine Art and gets a traditional academic drawing approach. This is the skill that he would use to execute his paintings on. At the French Academy, Sargent drew from the antique, which is just classical sculptures, and he also drew nude models from life. That was probably about 12-hour drawings. That's all just very typical academic stuff, and without getting too sucked into this rabbit hole of how French education works, we don't have enough time for that here today. I can do it another time. These ideas are really interesting though, because Sargent and anyone went through this very typical education that everyone received. It was actually free, sponsored by the state. It's no wonder that these guys became masters. They just had a great education system. They weren't born into some sort of talent. But beyond that, Sargent had this classmate. His name was Frank Fowler, and Sargent, or Fowler rather, he went through Atelier Cabanel, which is the workshop of Cabanel at the French Academy of Fine Art. And he also studied under Duran. Cabanel painted the fallen angel, by the way. He also studied under Duran. Fowler wrote a book, basically a handbook for students to learn the exact same techniques that they used at the French Academy. And it goes over all the materials too and holds up really well. It's an interesting read, except for the part where he says you can buy paper for 2 pennies a sheet. Yeah, that's not very helpful. Fowler outlines all the tools necessary for a academic drawing. Vine charcoal gets sharpened out to a point. You can make very thin erasable lines with it and put down a lot of tone. Charcoal pencil makes rich dark black hues. Paper stumps, they move the charcoal around just like a paintbrush would. So it's a great way to intuitively pick up the painting skills, how to control your hand, how to move the paper stump. It translates very well into painting. I think this is a really key component for Sargent and the way that he moves the paintbrush later on. And then laid paper, which is this unique paper with a ribbed texture. It's what everyone used back in the day, it was kind of a more classic way of making paper, but it catches the charcoal and smooths things out really nicely. So I have all of those materials and we're going to use those exact same things. But first, let's look at a few drawings by Sargent and understand how he built them. Here we have one of the few drawings that we have from Sargent's time at the Academy. The reason why we still have this one is because it won an award for the architecture drawing competition. That's what this blue stamp is here, and that's what these signatures are, signing the award. And then the French Academy keeps it, so we have it in their archives. And when we look at this, it's pretty incredible. We immediately think that this is unachievable masterwork, and it's very good, trust me, but we get deceived by the internet nowadays. There's not enough pixels here. If we actually look at some high resolution images of some of these areas, it becomes a little bit more understandable. It's still well executed, but none of this stuff is particularly crazy. I like this claw a lot, and you can see the individual lines here. What's happening is they're putting down this charcoal, and then they're using the paper stump to pull around these cylindrical ovoid forms right in here. It's not particularly incredible. They're just pulling up and around. They're not doing some sort of intricate hatching either. It's just nice structural painterly drawing, very painterly. We'll look at one of Sargent's portraits here. This is one of the portraits that Sargent is more well known for. Very typical Sargent style. He did these in about 3 hours, I believe. And what we see here is a nice shadow on the left side of the face. This is this shadow tone. And then we have a mid-tone that gets brushed over the whole face. Let me do that on another layer here. Mid-tone that gets brushed over the whole face. That's this right in here, a little bit darker. And Sargent comes in and erases out those highlights on those areas. It's basically just 3 tones. There's a little bit more complicated, darker tone in here, so maybe we can say 4 tones. That's just the level of light to dark. But it's actually built in a really ingenious and simple way, and it's quite scratchy in its technique. If we look at these scratchy lines right in here, this is not typical academic work. Academic work is a lot more scrupulous than this, to be doing this all over your drawing, hatching stuff out. In the late 19th century, they weren't so technical about everything being perfect, but really Sargent is not the most technical draftsman in these drawings. He's very fast and very efficient. That's what he cares about. And in this one, again, what makes Sargent's work so beautiful is this unifying idea of the whole. He's taking this entire frame and he's framing it beautifully. He's working the background, he's working the foreground. There's nice contrast. Her head is light in the dark, and then she has dark in the light in the foreground. That's yin and yang. That's the basis of all composition and contrast that creates form. We zoom in again, we see the same scratchy lines that Sargent makes in a lot of these works. It's not like his flowy brush marks. And the tone is relatively simple, right? Like we have this dark on the side. We'll brush that over. Dark on the side. Comes out towards the middle, right? He's pulling it out with the paper stump. I can be a little bit more careful here. Dark on the side. Pulls it out. And then this is just the white of the paper. And there's almost nothing going on in the modeling of the face. There's just that white of the paper, a little bit of smudging here at the edge of just the vine charcoal, very subtle value. So again, we're seeing that 2, 3 values, very simple structure. The proportions are good. And more importantly, the entire thing is worked as a unifying whole. That's what makes French art, and especially Sargent's art, so beautiful, is not focusing on all these little details, all these little features. Instead, he's focusing, how can I say the most with the least? And he's really quite structural too in a lot of these in clever ways. You can see here, he's hatching out this bridge of the nose coming in over like this. This is the nose bone right in here. And then we come out to the cartilage of the nose, the bridge of the nose out into the ball of the nose. He's very structural with just a few simple lines dashed right in there. And he's just hatching a general mid-tone over the whole face. This would generally get stumped around. This is probably the charcoal pencil because it didn't get smoothed out by the stump. And then he erases out these areas that are the brightest light and leaves it very simple. There's not a whole bunch of strands of hair going on up here. And another brilliantly beautiful drawing by Sargent. And again, we're just gonna see the exact same thing over and over. It's this nice level of efficiency, structural hatching out the inside of this eye socket. This is very common style of hatching at the time, where they're pulling into this eye socket, pulling out and around, just like a sculptor is gonna carve out, chisel out the inside of that eye socket. And overall, the tones are super simple, right? There's just dark on one side of the face, light on the other side of the face. This is just the light of the paper. He doesn't even touch this. Pretty scraggly line. But what makes it beautiful, again, is you stand back, that it's all worked as a whole. It's very confident. It's very strong. I think that's probably what I'm going to struggle with the most, is that level of confidence and knowing where to leave it. I'm overdue for a self-portrait. I haven't done one in many years, and I think we got everything we need now. We know the tools from Frank Fowler, and we know the technique that Sargent used. It's really not all that crazy. So now I just have to have the confidence to try and do it on myself. Let's give it a shot. Let's make a self-portrait just like Sargent. I have the same materials that he would have used in order to draw himself. I have some vine charcoal or willow charcoal. This one's willow, but same thing basically. They have slightly different properties. And I have it sharpened down out like a chisel. And then I have another Conte charcoal pencil. Actually, this one's not Conte. This is the Marie's brand. One of you guys in the comments told me to get the extra soft. It feels just like the Conte charcoal. So just a standard charcoal pencil. These ones blend very nicely with the blending stumps. And that is the real key here. This is just like painting. It feels exactly the same, and it's going to train you to become a better painter. And I also have some kneaded erasers too. They would also have a rubber eraser, and actually instead of a kneaded eraser, since they didn't have these at the time, they would have used stale bread, and they bake bread without butter so that it doesn't leave the oils in the canvas, and that's what they use. It's pretty simple, but you're going to see how effective and efficient these tools are. Let's get started. Here I'm just drawing like a fencer. I'm stepping in, I'm making my mark like a attack. I stick out my pinky for support. This is the proper drawing technique, drawing at arm's length, and then it forces you to take a step back after each brush stroke. That way you can reanalyze, look at everything as a whole. You don't get sucked in drawing on these little details. This is a very nice way to work, stepping in and out like a fencer attacking. So this early stage, I'm just looking for a envelope shape around my head. That's what's described in Frank Fowler's book, and I'm using comparative measurement to get my proportions right. That's comparing the width to the height of the head using my thumb and pencil measuring style, and none of the cite size stuff that wasn't used in the French academies at the time. The idea here is just to simplify everything down. I'm trying not to be too scratchy about this. I'm already on the edge of that, and I don't want to erase too much. I just want to think more and draw less. A lot of people think they need more and more control over their pencil, but really you don't need that much. You just need to have a good idea of the form and the proportion in your mind before you go to make the mark. You can't try to do both at once. That's a big mistake I see. Here's my brow line. And then 1/3 of the face, 2/3 of the face, 3/3 of the face. I've just checked, and I think my jaw is a little bit longer than the other 2/3 of my face. So these top two are equal, and then I think I have a little bit extra jaw. I can double check that just by taking a comparative measurement in the mirror. It's a little bit tricky when you're looking at yourself. Yeah, that makes sense. I think this is a good measurement here. It's just the most important thing. These early stages have to work well. This is the foundation of the house that you're going to build. And if you try to put the wallpaper on too early, the crown molding on too early, it's all gonna crumble away. There's one great article of somebody who comes to Sargent's teacher, Carolus Duran's studio, and he watches Duran paint a portrait, and Duran starts drawing, and the reporter says, or whoever's writing this article says, that he expected Duran to make some sort of prodigious show of talent, some spectacular masterpiece in the way that he drew, but actually Duran just took up the pencil and started making measurements like any humble student on his first cast painting. And I think that really struck me. There is no secret master technique to these old artists, to these Sargents. They just had better training. It wasn't some sort of secret materials or anything. They actually simplified the materials much more than we have nowadays. But the way they thought, the way they trained, their mindset towards it, these were the important ideas. There are many mistakes in this that I still need to correct, but if you want to paint like a master, of which I'm certainly not yet, It's not about getting everything right on your first try. It's about slowly closing in and performing the right, or using the right tools that you need to use at the right time. You need to use your comparative measurements early on in order to make sure you get those big proportions down. You need to use your envelope to get the gesture and the composition of the portrait in the frame properly. You need to use your understanding of form and construction later on in order to begin to understand where to carve out those shadows and planes on the face. There's no set technique that you need to use. You just need to dial in slowly, using each tool that you have to its fullest capacity before you employ the next one. It took me a long time to learn how to slow down. I used to just try to throw everything I could at it every drawing, but I started looking at old master drawings. I started looking at 19th century work. I started looking at the drawings of Sargent, and I realized that they weren't just throwing everything they could at the wall and seeing what stuck. No, they were slowing down. They were being methodical. They were thinking about what they were doing. And if I wanted to be great, I had to stop my bad habits, even though I don't want to. This is extremely difficult. I have to line myself up and remember the rotation of my head each time. It's going to take some understanding of the rotation of my head. It's not like I can just copy all the proportions, since my model essentially is always shifting around. I should be able to figure it out. I just have to be smart about this. At least Sargent could take a step back and compare his model to the work, whereas I really can't. I'm also discovering that since I can't take so many comparative measurements directly off of myself here in the mirror because my hand's in the way of my face, I'm realizing that I can just use my canon of proportions. I know that the lip line should be 2/3 of the way up from the chin to the nose, so I'm going to use that measurement instead. This is why it's nice to have a memorized canon of proportion, because it allows you to work conceptually without always needing the model. That's the weaknesses of just purely drawing optically, and why I teach construction. That's a major point of what I do, and it's vastly improved my ability to draw from imagination, is memorizing the structure, the planes of the face. But they weren't so bold with this stuff in the 19th century. I think that they understood it very well. You can look at the work of George Bridgman, a little bit later than Sargent, not too much later though. I mean, they're both alive at the same time, but Bridgman's students didn't draw like a bunch of boxes, even though Bridgman explained things in boxes. They used these models in order to translate themselves to their work. And you can look at Bridgman's students' drawings to see much more organic use of this knowledge. Again, that's what people are doing wrong nowadays. They're not interpreting the past with the lens of the past. They interpret the past how they would today. So they just copy Bridgman's drawings literally and try to draw everything like boxes. If you guys want to learn more about this technique and get feedback on your work so you know how to improve, I'm teaching a class on this exact technique starting June 8th. If you've seen this video close enough to when it came out, you might be able to catch that. And also, if you like this, make sure to subscribe. We're building this channel up. I'm taking this YouTube stuff very seriously, and we're on the come up right now. The more support that you guys give me, the bigger, crazier projects we can do. I have devious projects planned for this channel, so I appreciate all of your support. Thanks for being here. Okay, I feel really good about the proportions that I have here. Now I'm going to use the Vine charcoal to cover all the shadows and the shadow side with one even flat tone. That's what Vine charcoal does when you put it down, and then when you hit it with the stump, it forms an even medium dark tone. And I also have my charcoal pencil here. I'm going to use this to lock in certain details in here that I don't want to go away with the stump. If I do all of this without any charcoal pencil in here, then when I hit it with the stump, I'll lose my drawing, which could be okay, but I want to lock it in there. I struggled for this one, so I want to save some of those details. Let's get in here. I do need to be very careful with my charcoal pencil here, because the Vine charcoal will erase pretty much no matter how hard I put it down. The charcoal pencil is going to be a lot more stubborn in order to remove. So these strokes are permanent, and I need to think about them before I put them down. Nothing happened quickly in the 19th century. They were efficient, but slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Vine or willow charcoal goes down pretty dark, but when you hit it with the stump, it actually gets a little bit lighter, and it doesn't really hit black values. It's kind of a warm gray tone. And that's why it's nice for laying in. It's very erasable. You can establish your light and dark separation. But you've used your Conte charcoal, your charcoal pencil, for the rest or for the deep, dark modeling of the figure. It's going to move around a lot better. Since my eye is a ball, it's catching shadow on the left side since the light source is coming from the right. And then you can see it, let me look back, taper out to the cheekbone right in here. And in fact, the whole top side of this cheekbone does get a slight halftone. I won't smudge too much with my fingers though, I'm just thinking about these ideas. I'm looking at the absolute value of things and putting them neatly into their groups of light and shadow based off of their value. Sure, the hair is getting light on the right side over here, but it's still darker than my skin. So this is the light and this is the shadow. I'll use the biggest stump I can here to flatten out all of these values into one normal tone that I can work with. There's nothing really all that technical about this technique. Just my drawing and my shapes have to be perfect, my understanding of the form. That stuff has to be working very well under the surface here. By the time I'm stumping and rendering using this fine charcoal and Conte, I need to have everything right on the foundational level first. Although I do pull in the direction of the form with each stroke. So it's not completely random. When you're putting the vine charcoal down, I think I was a little bit too messy here. I would change that. But when you're putting the vine charcoal down, it doesn't matter that much because it's not like a hatch mark that's gonna stay, it's gonna get stumped in anyways. When you're using the stump, you really wanna flow with the form inside the eye socket, around the forehead, across the hair. These things can be felt by the viewer even if they're not immediately apparent. I really like this vine charcoal stage because it allows me to work just in a limited set of values, really 2 values, maybe 3 if you count the Conte. It allows me to simplify what I'm thinking about and work on this drawing just so I can get everything right before I move on to the modeling stage where I'm adding all sorts of values and transitions. You really have to just take your time here and step away, come back to it with fresh eyes. I hate to make adjustments like this and ruin the paper, but that's just a sign that I moved a little bit too fast. Now I have to adjust things. Doesn't help that I'm trying to hit a moving target here, that's for sure. I can begin, as I feel more comfortable, to take my stump and drag outwards towards the light. And dragging these shadows out towards the light, that's just how light works. You know, we're rounding around the edge of a corner and pulling out into the light. So this is a very intuitive process working in these limited values. And you look at any 19th century work, especially a lot of Sargent drawings, you'll see they really don't do a whole lot of modeling. They don't do a lot of volume of charcoal. They don't put a lot of graphite or hatches or anything into the lights. They keep their lights very clean, scrupulously clean, and then they put all of their work into the transitions of the shadows. And that's exactly how light works. That's just what Lambert's law is. That's the rate of light fall off. Light stays very bright, and then as we get towards the darkness, it gets darker and darker and darker very quickly. It's not a linear curve. I think I'm just gonna have to put the whole mustache into one value group. It's certainly not as light as the skin. This is what you do when you get to this stage. You start comparing everything. Is my mustache darker than my skin tone? Is it as dark as the shadow? It is actually pretty close to the value of the shadow. It's even darker in areas like this, so this is probably close to the value of my shadow here, and then in my skin tones here, it's nowhere near as light as that. So this is gonna get grouped in. I'm kind of worried about giving myself too much of the Giga Chad jawline. I think this is more accurate. I think earlier it was like a little bit too wide. I don't want people to, if you make yourself look too different in a self-portrait, I'm gonna get a lot of weird comments, all right? I'm not that vain. Okay, I do want to push down the shadows a little bit. I have these alpha color black pastels. I saw this great artist Steve Houston uses these with the paper stumps, so I want to try that to push down the values further. Otherwise, I'll just layer in the Conte charcoal, and we'll see how that does. Sargent really does push down a deep dark value, pulls out a mid-tone, and he tends to pull out, actually, especially on his male figures, a more general tone over the whole face and then erase out the highlights. He also will use a thick outline around the edges of the head too, which is normally flattening. It's not very common for the time, but he uses it and it works. This is half Temu supplies and half supplies that I've never used before. So don't do what I do. Don't copy what I do. I think I'm gonna start running into the problem where everyone just runs to buy what I buy. Guys, I got no idea what I'm doing. Don't stop listening to me. At least when it comes to materials, that is. I just really don't care that much about what materials I use as long as I work on my drawing skills and such. Now, it's going to be my tendency to soften these things up too much and work on the edges, but the genius of Sargent is he knows where it's good enough, where it's going to read from 5 feet back, 10 feet back, and he just leaves it there. So I got to be careful here not to overwork the image. I'm only, I don't know, 2.5 hours or so in, maybe probably not even. So I'm not super worried about it yet, but we're going to get in that territory quick. I have more charcoal on my face than a coal miner. I can't tell what's a shadow and what's just charcoal. It's not good. And it's kind of all too common for me. I think I finally found what's causing the issue with my chin here. I knew it didn't have a likeness, but I didn't know why. I'm gonna take my chin a little bit further in. It's much more accurate, I think. I made some mistakes in this drawing, though. It's not perfectly clean. It's gonna hurt the surface of the drawing. Now, when we work on this hair, we have to remember the value group of the whole. So it's not just all these little highlights or all these strands or clumps of hair. We have to understand how these things fit into their entire group. If any one part of them becomes too light, if I make this, let me get my eraser here. If I make this strand of hair super bright, it's gonna steal attention away from the rest of the drawing. This is what's important, how everything fits together. This is what Sargent is a complete master of. So everything has to fit within its value group. The hair is darker and its highlights are a mid-tone. The highlights are probably more like this and the darks are like this. This is the French idea of the ensemble, and it's what makes Sargent so good. It's my tendency to get into these areas with really small hatch marks, but actually Sargent uses these big clumps, these strong lines on these strands of hair. So I will try to replicate that instead of falling into my old habits. Always best to put the darks in first if you don't know what to do. Now I can use my eraser or my kneaded eraser to get in here and make these larger, chunkier highlights on these areas that the light is coming down and hitting very directly. I'm extremely uncomfortable with leaving the hair in this state, but the values are about the same that Sargent would bring them to, and I actually think that's about the level of resolution that he would get to it. To me, it just doesn't feel right, but what's more important is that I work down and I finish the whole composition. I don't think this one needs a background. I'm not sure. If it did need a background, I should have already put it on, because after you get that background on, you have to adjust everything relative to the background. So it's something you want to add as you go. Here I have the front plane of my face. It's only really the side-facing planes that are getting the bright light. So the front plane of my forehead, that's going to get the mid-tone. The front plane of my cheekbone here, the front plane on the top of the cheekbone, or that's the top plane. The top plane of the nostril right here, these are going to start to get a medium tone. I think we're in a pretty good spot here. It's been just about 3 hours, which is the amount of time that Sargent typically tried to spend on these, and I've gotten it up to a decent level. There's a lot of areas that I want to get in there and resolve, but I know that Sargent wouldn't do it either, so I really have to hold myself back. And I'm just gonna sit on this one. I'm gonna look at it again tomorrow morning and see what I think about it. I might make a few small adjustments, but we'll see. Okay, well, it's been about 5 seconds. Just want to make a few adjustments, all right? I'm never really sure how to feel about my art. I mean, who can be an objective observer of their own artwork? But there's a lot of things about this that I like. And while I was taking a break, walking back through that door, coming in from my hallway, I realized that actually does look like a Sargent from far away. It has the same effect, doesn't have the same level of confidence, but that technique there, the tools that were used, it does feel very similar. And I think that's a success. I can be really happy with that. The chin's still a little big. I'm not beating the Giga Chad allegations, all right? And there's a lot of areas that I noticed that I could actually be messier. Going back and looking at Sargent's work, he's way sloppier with his marks and his technique, but I think that tells us not to be messy, not to be sloppy in our works, but when to know where our confidence is needed and where we can be refined, be very technical, and also where we can loosen up and get to the right result anyways. That's something that just takes many years to learn. And Sargent was doing this stuff a lot longer than I was when he made those portraits. So there's still a lot that I can learn in the confidence factor from Sargent. And I'll definitely be coming back to paint some of his work for a portrait very soon. I think that I can learn a lot from his level of color too. He's absolutely genius with how he uses color. We haven't even gotten close to how this guy works the brush in such a beautiful way. We saw the paper stump, but that's only half of what the brush can do. So overall, I think this was a huge success. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I'll see you guys next time. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Appreciate y'all.